Okay. I think we'll get started. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I think this is the first time the City Council has had a joint meeting with the Tree Commission, and I am very glad that we are starting a new tradition this evening. So I think the first thing we'll do is go around with introductions, and then we'll, I was asked to moderate the meeting tonight, so I will do that. And do you want to, are you coming in, or? Yes, it is. Come on in. So, Tina, why don't we have you start, and then we'll just go around this way.
Hi, I'm Tina Murray.
I'm Carol Houghton.
Gresham Lowe.
Chairman.
New chairman, very new.
Very new, okay.
Please
Danny
keep
May.
that in mind.
Colleen Cordes.
Rizzi Qureshi.
I'm Fred Schultz.
Kate Stewart.
Tim Mail.
Peter Kovar.
Jesse Carpenter.
Suzanne Ludlow.
Daryl Brinkley.
Kenneth Sigmund.
Jason Daimler.
Great, terrific. So I hope everyone has an agenda for them. Did we have them for the members of the public?
On this chair.
If you'd like them. And tonight I'm actually going to try and keep us to the times. I want to first thank the Tree Commission for working with myself and the city staff for putting together the agenda. And I think it's a good agenda that we're going to get through tonight, and I'd like to stick to the times. So and I think we can do that. So with that, we're going to begin this evening by talking about the role of the Tree Commission. And we thought we would start off with the city manager just kind of reviewing the role of the commission, how it's been laid out, so we all are kind of starting from the same place.
Thanks very much. And I actually had some education of my own to prepare for tonight's meeting. And one of the things that I think is very helpful is the information that's been attached or shared along on the website related to this agenda. The Tacoma Park Code related to the Tree Commission has very general language about what the Tree Commission is. It says a Tree Commission is established to preserve, protect, and promote the urban forest of Tacoma Park. That's your mission. The composition is to be composed of up to 5 city residents appointed by the council. And the function is that the Tree Commission, with the assistance of the arborist, shall propose rules, regulations, procedures, and actions to be taken by the city to preserve and protect the urban forest, subject to the approval of the council, and perform any other related duties assigned by the council by ordinance or resolution. And then there's very little mention kind of about the Tree Commission until it gets into kind of appeals for from permit decisions. And so in this different section of the code, it talks about that a permit applicant or any resident may appeal a preliminary approval of an application for a tree permit within a 15-day notice of the posting of a tree removal request. And then it talks about coming to the Tree Commission for hearing that appeal. And for many years, that was the primary activity of the Tree Commission. And very little extra really was done by the Tree Commission. It was kind of organized as an adjudication body for these tree permit requests. In the past 3 years, there's been more activity. And there's been tree walks that have been sponsored by the Tree Commission. There have been articles in the newsletter, which kind of help spread the word about the trees and show your interest. And then, of course, there's been interest, as we've talked about, whether it's protection of the tree canopy or concern about utility work, where people have wondered, well, what should the role of the Tree Commission be, and what parameters are there? And one of the things that I think will be a very interesting discussion that may start this evening, is some ideas about that. I'm a little bit uncomfortable in general with the very broad description of the Tree Commission, and we compare it a little bit to say, the Committee on the Environment and a variety of other ones, which kind of have discussions with the council about the priorities for the year and that kind of thing. And so some of that may be something that might be considered as we move forward with the Tree Commission. I think that's about all I'm going to cover at this point, but it's, again, a little bit surprising to me how first broad the Tree Commission's mission is, and then how very little is actually specified about what you do. And so I hope we go through that as we talk about the tree ordinance.
Great, thank you. So we were going to spend a little time talking more about the role of the Tree Commission, and then after that, just to go down the agenda so everyone knows where we're going this evening, we're going to get into a little bit of the role of the Urban Forester Manager, which is a new title for the city arborist, and I'll turn it back over to, at that point, to the city manager to discuss that as well. And then we'll talk about the priorities for the city, a discussion of issues related to PEPCO, WSSC, and other public utilities, and then finish up with sort of some big picture thoughts on the tree ordinance and where to go from there. But back to the role of the commission and all of you. We thought we would explore here what are some improvements that we want to put in place to help you all do your job. And I know there was also, well, why don't we start there? If members of the council or city staff or the commissioners have any thoughts about things that we could do to improve your role.
We actually have some prepared remarks on each one of these agenda items, and each one of us in turn was going to take a distinct was going to discuss each one of these agenda items, if that's okay.
That's great.
Certainly welcome the comments. So with respect to, well, first I'd like to point out that Susie did an excellent job of summarizing what we see as our role.
Mm-hmm.
We've always seen, well, in I would say the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen our role as advisory, judicial, and outreach and education. And each one of those we think comes directly out of either Title II, Chapter 2, the establishment and function, or Chapter 12, directly from the tree ordinance. So with respect to agenda item 2, the role of the Tree Commission, the first 2 bullet points in our discussing these, we decided that they really belong together. In other words, what improvements can be put in place to help the Tree Commission do its work directly requires opportunities to increase the transparency, communication, and documentation. So we had six suggestions. The first one being that the Urban Forest Manager should serve as a liaison between the Tree Commission and city staff, which would include monthly attendance at monthly Tree Commission meetings. And we noticed that this was explicitly mentioned in the job description for the Urban Forest Manager, and we greatly appreciate that. We also would like to see more active collaboration among city staff, city council, and the Tree Commission on tree-related issues, as well as proposed changes in policy. And this would include timely communication on issues when they first arise, such as proposed utility work, and we'll go into that hopefully in greater detail. We would also like to consider having access to relevant data, such as the number of trees permits that are granted or denied, and the number and species of trees planted, which allows us to serve in our advisory capacity to the city staff and city council. Again, we would be working with the Urban Forest Manager on this. We would also like to suggest having annual meetings with the city council and staff to present what we're doing, and whether it would take this form or whether it would take the form of a presentation during a hearing. We've done the latter in the past, but that's something to be determined. Another thing we think that would be very helpful would be to improve documentation for tree permits, so that written records of all tree evaluations, which are called health analysis rating scales in chapter 12, those should be available, and it would be desirable to have them put online, or at least available upon request. And I think this would help with residents' understanding of how it would make the whole process less opaque and more open to the to residents. And also, another thing we've noticed is that tree evaluations should be provided for each tree removal, denial, or approval in the form letter that's sent to the homeowner. This has come up repeatedly in hearings when the homeowner simply gets a form letter that states that the tree permit request has been denied, but there's no reason given, and this is frustrating and puzzling, I think. So I think this is a matter of good customer service for the city to provide this kind of information. So those are our 6 points, and we welcome comments on that.
Great. Well, thank you. I will turn to my colleagues on the City Council. Anyone have any comments or questions?
Well, yeah, what I want to understand with all of these recommendations and comments is the difference between what you're requesting or commenting here and what has been practice up until very recently when the current when our arborist left. So because like you, for example, you said it would be good to have the urban forest manager attend tree commission meetings. I don't know. Is that new? Or is that different?
It is, because with the previous arborist, he almost never attended meetings. There was very poor communication, and again, I don't want to get into criticisms or critiques.
No, you need to get in. You need to be able to be clear with us. Where the person we're talking about is no longer with the city. I mean, be polite about the whole thing, but otherwise, we need your help to understand.
Perhaps it's something that I could just mention.
Yeah.
The recommendations that you made, many of these are things that we have expectations going forward, whether it's the participation of the urban forest manager at the meetings, or a lot of the information being posted online about the trees and shared with the public in an open format. That's something we're already working on. So I think those are perfect suggestions that we would be following up on, that for a variety of reasons we haven't had in the past, but we want to have going forward.
Well, I might also say too that part of this has to do with the transition of the tree commission. In lieu of any clear change in policy or guidance documents. So the tree commission really used to function as an adjudication body for appeals. And as soon as the tree commission started to expand its interest and role for education, promotion, advocacy, the arborist really felt like his position was to be there for adjudications and not for their discussion of advocacy. The issue of advocacy in the arborist role kind of creates this inherent tension. How can you be an advocate and a bureaucrat? So there is that sort of issue, and the tree commission chose to move forward in their role as educators, advocates, promoters. At that point, the arborist said, I'll appear for hearings, but not for your discussion of advocacy, promotion. So that probably could do with a dose of council input and guidance, so that then on a staff level we could know what's the role. Do we want to be advocating? Do we want to be overseeing an ordinance implementation? So that, I think that was part of a separation of the arborists in a staff role for the tree commission. I don't know, Carol, you've been involved in that longer than me. If you feel like I haven't captured it correctly, let me know. But
yeah, I mean, I see your point. I do have to say that the arborist before Todd did actually run the meetings, the tree commission meetings, and so when I first started back in 2000, that the attendance at our meetings was just considered standard. And then from the beginning, for whatever reasons, Todd was just reluctant to.
And with that
attend our
former
meetings.
arborist, am
Yeah.
I wrong in assuming that most of the hearings were, or most of the meetings were related to hearings and adjudications versus general information?
I would say, okay, let me put it this way. I would say that our outreach and education, the outreach and education part of our role has been increasing over what I would say is at least 5 years. And this is, I have to say, in part due to comments made by city council members in the city council hearings. So, I mean, and we have felt that, you know, since then we have felt that, okay, this is an additional mission. And I do have to say that that we have taken our direction directly from the establishment part of Chapter 2, which states, you know, 2.16.020, a tree commission is established to preserve, protect, and promote the urban forest of Tacoma Park. So, I mean, I think we've always felt that that was a legitimate part of our role. I believe I even consulted with Ken Sigmund on that at one point. If you recall, I was actually looking for the email and I couldn't find it, but I'm sure it's there somewhere.
Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. So correct me if anything that I'm saying is you know, not right in terms of, you know, the legal aspect of it, legal interpretation.
No, I agree with that, and
Yeah.
I agree with your recollection kind of how meetings have gone in the past. Even, you know, back in the early 2000s, I remember we might have a hearing, but we'd also have just a portion of the meeting set aside for tree commission business.
Yeah, and basically policy, how the tree ordinance was working, better ways to protect. So.
If I could just jump in a
Yes.
couple of thoughts on this, and they don't pertain specifically to the commission, but the mix of duties between the commission and the manager, the tree urban canopy manager. I think of something that's sort of falling through the cracks is the ability to provide advice to residents that they value. So if someone has a non-native or invasive mulberry tree or some other plant on their property, you know, who helps them figure out, you know, it'd be great if you would cut that down and replace it with X. That kind of advice that, you know, sort of builds up a supply of goodwill and also promotes the goals of the tree canopy. I think that's something that sort of falls through the cracks.
I'm sorry, could you explain, do you think that falls through the cracks
with our current set of policies around the urban canopy. So, you know, that's not something that the previous arborist spent a lot of his time on. And I'm not saying that there aren't trade-offs, right? Because the other pieces of our tree code take a lot of time. But I think that's an important part that there are lots of residents who could be planting trees or have invasive trees, maybe more than are interested in cutting down trees, and yet we spend our time on the cutting down trees part.
Can
It's
I
my
interrupt
perception.
one more time so do you feel that the tree commission should have this area of expertise to advise?
I don't know. So my honest answer is I don't know. I'm just raising it as an issue. And then the other piece is that, you know, with regard to the enforcement duties and then the advocacy duties, I think of our police as a model. We expect our police to arrest people who need to be arrested. We also expect them to hand out candy, organize barbecues, you know, rescue stray cats, and be friendly and go up and talk to strangers and make people feel welcome, right? So we expect in a police officer all those duties and then to bridge that gap. And I think if we have a person who manages our tree program who can do the enforcement pieces, but can also do the advocacy, the outreach, the customer service piece, that's a similar level of expectation.
Can I jump in? I think your sixth point is something that speaks to me the most. And you said provide reason for tree permit denial, but I think overall to me and what I hear from Ward 3 residents is the customer service aspect of it. I think people don't hear from the arborist or from the tree commission until they realize that they owe a lot of money because they made a mistake. And I think or they did it deliberately. So I think some education at the front end for the community is important, and I can give you, I mean, there's a perfect example in my neighborhood. I don't think, maybe it's because we don't have a current tree arborist. I don't think they got any approval to knock down a bunch of trees. And I think people go sort of fly under the radar. These are new residents. They're flipping the house. They don't know any better. It's in a hidden backyard. And you know, these kinds of things happen. So I think if you all can work towards, and forgive me if this is not within your purview, but just even some kind of literature to hand out to residents to advise them of here's what the tree commission does, here's what the tree ordinance says, and here are what your obligations are. Because people, rightfully so to some extent, come into this community, enjoy its tree canopy, but think, well, this is my property, so I can obviously do whatever I want. I think there's nothing wrong with people inherently thinking that. But I think the more we educate, I think then the customer service aspect of it becomes better, and they go into it with some kind of important understanding of how to approach the issue. So I'm really focused on, as our city continues to flip with new residents, is to find a vehicle to educate new residents, to make them aware of what they're sort of getting themselves into.
And I think that was the goal in the last reiteration of the tree ordinance. We added language that requires it as part of the closing documents. When you purchase a home, there's now a disclosure statement. So short of that, which I think is a pretty powerful tool, it's hard to get to every new owner, but it was, I think, a real improvement in providing that information right up front. When you buy a house in Tacoma Park, when you're signing your lead statements, you have to sign a statement that says the city has a very strict tree ordinance and you need to be aware of it. So that's right up front, right in your purchase process. And I think that was a really wise decision that the council made, and that the city attorneys worked the language in, and it's now part of every purchase of a city property, that information and information about the ordinance is handed to that resident. Now they may choose to ignore it because you got a stack of papers that you're signing, but it at least is getting that information across right at the introduction of your purchase.
I'll just add, I think particularly contractors who are buying houses to flip them, they know about the city's tree laws. They choose to ignore it.
No.
Councilman McCovar?
Well, I just want to say on that point, when I looked at the ordinance, it looked like there's an exception for sheriff sales and when people pass property along to their relatives. So I think if what
Just got a promotion.
Congressman Qureshi is talking about, that might not be the situation. And I also think, I mean, I hear what Ms. Braithwaite is saying, but I mean, when I bought my house, you're signing so many things.
Yeah.
You might say, oh, there's a tree thing, but you're not going to remember that 12 years later. So it may be that the type of information that needs to be listed periodically in the newsletter or sent out to people in some way, because it's just too much to expect that in the stress of signing, your historic certification thing and your lead thing and all the other things, most people are just not going to really absorb that unless they're actively focused on that in a certain way. So I think as far as it goes, it's helpful, but it doesn't cover everything. And I don't think there should be these exceptions. If I read the law correctly, I don't see why, of all the exceptions, why, if there's a foreclosure sale, maybe we don't have very many of them, but why that would be an exception. So.
When we talk about outreach and education, one idea that we were going to mention is the idea of sending mailings on the tree ordinance and tree care annually to all residents, like maybe a postcard or something like that, and that we have been working on a draft for that kind of thing. We've talked to Daryl, we've talked to you in the past about doing that sort of thing, and we really wanted to kind of resurrect that because we agree, even folks who've been here for a long time, they kind of need that information kind of constantly, little reminders about what it's all about.
Yeah, Councilmember Smith.
A couple things. One, I think that this document that new homeowners buy, when it discloses about our tree canopy, should be given to them as soon as they sign the purchase agreement. So that way, you will actually know what you're getting into.
It'd be nice for them to read it before they sign.
Right. Yes. Another thing is, I had a situation where a new owner bought a house, but their homeowner's insurance company said a tree needed to be removed. So it wasn't something that they wanted to do, but for them to actually get insurance on their home, the tree was an issue. And there wasn't any really leeway in the code for them to get the tree removed, because they were afraid, the insurance company was afraid that there was going to be a strong wind and it would damage the roof. So I hope that when we consider options for the new code, that we can look at that. What happens when, you know, you go through all the process, you look at the property, you see, you might even get an evaluation by an arborist that says, oh, all these trees are fine. But if the insurance company comes in and says, no, we think that this is a threat to the property that you spent $700,000 on, what does a resident do then?
The resident goes to Daryl's department.
Well,
follows procedure.
Yes.
Can I just ask that we table that for one moment until we get to that section of the agenda, and we just close. Councilmember Smith, before you came in, I said I was really going to keep to the times tonight and move us through our agenda. I think all of us have had very long week, and it's just the beginning. So I wrote that down so that we can come back to it when we talk about the tree ordinance specifically, and if there are some big picture things. I think in terms of the role of the tree commission, I appreciate very much you outlining these 6 things, and what I'm seeing from the city staff is that it makes a lot of sense to them. I think what you're hearing from my colleagues and myself here on the council is that this role of greater advocacy and education is something that we want to continue to explore ways to do that. So I think we'll move on then and have the city manager or the director of public works talk about the role of the urban forest manager and how that may change as we fill this new position.
Right, I am going to turn it over to Daryl Breakaway, but each time we have an opening for a position, it's useful to think it through and see have things changed? Do we have different expectations? Do we have some things that we want to? Even picking the name that seemed a little more accurate to what the role is, which is to manage our urban forest, made more sense than the city arborist. So, Gerald, you want to tell a little bit about the role?
Sure. Well, we currently have that position advertised on the city's website in a number of different places, and we've gotten some great responses to the advertisement. Historically, we tend to have an arborist on place for 6 to 10 years, so it tends to be a position that sort of either is a stepping stone for someone to move up to county and other higher levels, or is a kind of a position for someone towards the end of their career and they've done it and then they're done. So we've seen both those avenues, and I think each arborist that we've had since I've been here, which is almost now 30 years, is about that time frame. So it's a pretty cyclical position. What that says is it gives us an opportunity to, pretty regularly take a look at that position description and make sure it's still communicating what we need. So in this current advertisement, we've kept the roles pretty much similar in terms of a majority of the work is implementing the city codes and the tree law. We've also tried to emphasize the expectation that this person will serve, as you say, as a liaison with the tree commission and work very much in a partnership role with that tree commission. And then also that the expectation is community outreach to the extent they can through newsletter articles, through web page, web information, that basically there's an expectation that information about tree health in general, tree maintenance in general, tree issues, of course continuing the annual Arbor Day tradition that has been a part of the city for decades. So those are the expectations. So we anticipate that the new person coming in will have a very clear understanding that not only are they serving as the urban forest manager, which means reviewing permits, making decisions related to the tree ordinance, identifying violations and following up on those, but also dealing with the tree commission, working in partnership with the tree commission and doing a great bit of communication and education. That being said, it is a single person role, which we have a couple of those in public works. So as a single person position, we do have administrative support for that position, so the processing of the permits and the paperwork is handled by administrative staff. But it, you know, it is one person, and there's only a 40-hour expectation, so there's limitations about how much can be done, though I think for someone who stays on board for 7 to 10 years, you can accomplish quite a bit in terms of promotion, education, and getting those avenues really well established and refreshing those every few years so that the newsletter articles are staying current and the information on the website is staying current. I also think that technology has is going to benefit us, and I see that in this new position, obviously a new inventory is necessary. We're way overdue for an inventory of the city's trees. Of course, that's only on public property. We really haven't gotten our hands around inventory on private trees. But I think the Tree Commission can work with us on that to try to developing things like a tree canopy goal and other things that the Committee on the Environment is interested in. And to the degree that we have that balance of private space and public space, you know, again, we'll look for the council's guidance on those kinds of things. But we're you know, we're in a good opportunity for bringing a new person on board with some renewed clarity and expectation in terms of how they administer the position.
The other thing I want to mention is that there are some kind of past expectations that didn't get filled about managing noxious growth, ivy up trees, and that kind of thing, that would take you over the 40 hours. With the new kind of the neighborhood services team in the police department, that ends up being something that they can take more activity on. So that, I think, will help advance the health of the trees overall in the community without it necessarily being within the time frame of the urban forest manager's job. So that's something that you know, we'll go forward and see how that goes, but I think that it should be manageable.
Okay. And if I could just follow up on the point that Councilmember Mail raised before about the ability to provide advice to residents, you know, again, emphasizing it's one person, but, you know, I think in the past it was very clearly stated to residents that no, that was not the job, and whether or not that would change with the new position.
Well, and I'll be working with Susie on that, because it really does put the person in a awkward position from time to time. And the arborist, there's certain types of tree evaluations that we can do, and the person that we'll be hiring will be someone who's trained in hazard tree evaluation and tree health and tree maintenance, and so they'll have all the required technical expertise. That said, to do you know, there's many levels of tree evaluation that we do. And currently with our tree ordinance, we do what's called a level 2 tree evaluation, which is a visual evaluation. It's looking at a tree, it's standing there, it's walking around, it's knowing what you know about trees and gathering whatever information you can visually see, as well as tapping and doing sound tests and, you know, using your base of knowledge to evaluate the tree. There's a higher level of tree evaluation that can be done. And if somebody really wants information about their tree, that's the level they should go to, and that's not a level that we're prepared on a staff level to be able to offer to folks. So they really need to bring in the expertise of a consulting arborist, at least it has been our position, for that level of evaluation of a tree. So what we tend to do is evaluate a tree based on an application for removal. So the arborist goes out on site to evaluate a tree once we get an application in. We have not gone, you know, kind of on a phone call, kind of come here and let me talk to me about my trees. We don't have the staff hours for that. The level of applications that we get in keeps someone busy just processing the level of applications and the potential enforcement issues, and then also the management and the tree planting and the watering. So that is really a full-time job. If we want to start looking at additional advice and expertise and counsel outside of the ordinance and the removal applications, it would really require additional staff hours that we don't have available.
I do want to just follow up on that one aspect though, because I think that, you know, I would really like to see the person go to community meetings and that kind of thing. We could ask some more general questions and not necessarily be a consulting arborist to help somebody else, but at a meeting, you know, tell the information, maybe ask somebody's questions just that's standing there. To me, I see that within the role. As a little bit more farther on that, I think we're going to have to see how the staff hours go, and we do have to defer to the requirements of the code first.
But we can change the requirements of the code.
We can, and we can have budget discussions about FTEs, and that's fine. But that's kind of where we end up having to see how we move.
Thank you. I guess I had more than one conversation with Todd over the years about his capacity, which you just described pretty accurately. It matches pretty much what he told me.
Councilmember Schultz, can you just speak that way? Because I'm thinking some of the members of the tree commission are having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll yell. How's that? Is this thing on?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
You're good.
Basically, what Daryl said matched exactly to what Todd had told me in conversations that I had had with him over the years. Is that the task of permit approvals and going out and looking at situations and granting waivers and keeping track of problem issues was a full-time job, a 40-hour-a-week job. He rued the fact that there was nobody around to be on the lookout for violators on weekends. And he's, you know, and that's just a reality. And whereas with the police department, they're on duty, you know, all the time. And he was pretty clear that while he would have liked to have been able to do more of some of the stuff we're talking about, he just didn't have the time of day. In fact, he told me once that even when we stipulated that a property, an owner of a tree who had to plant trees, that he didn't have the ability to really go out and find and do a proper ascertain that the trees that needed to be planted, the new ones, had actually been done, and expressed frustration about it. But the ironical thing is whenever I suggested, well, do you need assistance, he was very quick to say, oh no, I can do all this, don't worry about it. That last remark probably is neither here nor there, because we're forward looking, and so the question that comes to my mind is regarding to the expanding of the tree commission, to the extent that, and I realize you're volunteers, but I know we've done some tree walks that were extremely interesting to me, at least the one you did in my neighborhood. If you see if the tree commission could possibly, if there were more members, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, could see its role as providing some of the counseling to property owners about types of species, where you might want to plant a tree, and all that kind of stuff, or even conducting little workshops for property owners who are really fascinated by the whole subject and want to turn to somebody where they can get information, because I think the education component is so vital to our mission here.
If I could just add that we have conducted 2 workshops, I think, over the last 4 years, and we've had 2 to 3 people show up at each one. So it's been difficult to bring people to workshops. The tree walks have been extremely successful. 2 of them were actually led by the arborists, and we would love to do more of those. I do have to say I'm a little bit hesitant about serving as sort of expert advice, because nobody on the commission is, well, I should say, anybody, any resident can apply for and be a member of the commission. There's no expertise required. We actually do have a landscaper currently who is actually a very good source of information. And we did briefly have an actual arborist, but for the most part, we're made up of ordinary Joes and Janes with different levels of expertise, and we've picked up a lot over the years. But I just wanted to put that as sort of a cautionary note. But on the other hand, I think the tree walks is something we hope to continue, and hopefully if we can get to the other agenda items, the outreach and education, we have a lot of ideas there. So.
Yeah, I was concerned, wanted to make sure you all knew we try to represent all the wards, and we're essentially volunteers with a real interest in the tree canopy. I happen to have a professional background. The reason I volunteered is because I ran into, professionally, so much confusion. Why? Oh, I have to what? That kind of thing over and over. And my general advice has always been, go to the website, call Public Works. The arborist will guide you. You can't do anything without, no additions, no nothing, without the professional okay with our regulations.
Colleen, did you want to say something?
Well, when we get to the outreach and education, I think we'll have some, because it's very helpful for us just in terms of sharing. Yeah.
Was there anything else that the Tree Commission wanted to say about the roles and responsibilities of the urban forest manager? No.
Oh, I have lots of things to say.
Okay, you're up.
First of all, I reviewed the job application, the description, and I noticed that you're not requiring any certifications, and at the very end of it, so no ISA certification, no
they have to
Maryland
be a
tree
licensed tree expert.
Well, I suggest that wording be in the job description a little more clearly, because it says in addition.
It certainly should be. I mean,
Yeah,
that was what I wrote. If it didn't get in there, that's
It
HR.
says highly competitive candidates will have, but it's not listed under minimum qualifications. So
Yeah, and so I suggest that language be added when I re-reviewed, because I'm a horticulturist, I'm not an arborist.
Yeah, we would, the expectation is that they be a licensed tree expert and that they have hazard tree evaluation certification from ISA. So we wouldn't hire anybody that didn't have those minimum qualifications. And I could go back to the HR folks if they've somehow changed the
It's not clear.
expectation.
Yeah, it's not clear. And I went to the American Association of Public Works. No, I'm not saying it. AW. Public,
ISA,
well, not the ISA.
Actually.
APWA.
Public Works managers and staffing, and read the Urban Forester, the recommendation for qualifications. They also list state certified pesticide applicator license, along with the ISA certified arborist with municipal specialist, which I thought was pretty cool because it means a specialist in the urban canopy.
Yeah, we don't do a pesticide certification because we don't apply pesticides, and we do that through consulting and contractual services, so we don't have that expectation.
That's what I thought, but I read
It's
it and,
it's difficult to get if you're not in a company that provides pesticide application. So it would be almost impossible to maintain a pesticide certification if you're not in an industry that regularly uses pesticides. So it becomes kind of a catch-22 for.
Right. But what I really liked were the general recommendations for the urban forest manager. So I was personally, in the whole tree commission, we were really happy to see that umbrella broaden a bit. And we, in general, see our role as supporting that. Again, remember, we're not trained specialists in this. So with that in mind, let me go back to my little little thing. We strongly urge that the urban forest manager should be ISA certified and possess the Maryland Tree Expert License, which I believe is a requirement. If you're working with trees and advice, you need that. We're unclear how a staff person without those qualifications would be able to evaluate tree hazards and effectively carry out terms of Chapter 12.
Yeah, we won't allow that a person that doesn't have those qualifications to be hired.
Thank you. We think it's desirable to have a background in native Mid-Atlantic seaboard forestry and focus on those native trees, that are native to our area. I assume that would happen, but I don't ever like to assume on such things. So we just wanted to say it. We see ourselves, we see the urban forest manager serving as a liaison with us, the tree commission, as indicated above. And the city should consider restoring administrative support available for such tasks as filing permits and placing evaluations online and maintaining the arborist page. We see very, very clearly how stretched that position is. We're very aware of it. And again, we see our role as supporting that. So we can do due diligence on aspects. We think the mailings idea is great. And does anyone else have a comment regarding the urban forest manager?
Can I say something?
Yeah,
I'd just like to throw this in. With your generosity, we had a speaker come to Tacoma Park last month, Doug Tallamy from the University of Delaware, talking about biodiversity in our yards and in our city in general, and he had a lot to say about the trees and about the role of trees in maintaining and protecting the basic biodiversity of our community. So I would just, first of all, like to thank you all thank the city for making the money available for that talk to take place, and it's available on YouTube thanks to the filming that was done. I really would recommend that anybody has an interest in understanding better about the role of native trees and native plants in our local ecosystem. Take a look at that. It's really, really educational and moving. And I know as a homeowner myself, my attitude toward my yard and my trees was completely transformed when I became aware of what Doug Tallamy is putting out there. And he's highly, highly respected. He's a real expert. So anyway, that's out there, and thank you all for helping bring him here.
Great. All right. Well, I think we're all excited about the new urban forest manager and getting on board.
So
do you
one
have
last- do you have a target date as to when you want to have someone in place?
I would love by the first of the year to have someone in place.
Terrific. All right.
We have very good, we've gotten some really good candidates on board, which I'm thrilled, because we're currently in competition with DC and a couple utilities, so there's a lot of activity in hiring arborists.
That's excellent. I'm very happy to hear that. Okay.
Terrific. Well, our next agenda item was priorities for the city. I don't know, since you all seem to have done some great preparing for it, do you want to kick off on that section? Is that Colleen?
Yeah, so this does relate to things that we've been discussing, and it's great to hear the the enthusiasm on the part of the council for doing more of this. And the question is, how can the city actually do more of this? Our role is in, if you look at our statutory function, it's in proposing things that the city can do to protect, preserve, and promote. And to the extent we can do outreach and development, we've really enjoyed that and we're interested in doing that. But to the need is probably greater than a volunteer, my own personal opinion would be greater than what a volunteer commission can execute. But we can certainly help make that happen, and certainly we can work with the arborist. I loved Suzanne's idea of the community meeting, that that the arborist can reach a lot more people through a community meeting than in individual phone calls to residents, and that certainly we could help make that happen too, and we could, we'd be very interested in that sort of thing. So in addition to this idea of like an annual mailing, it could just be a letter or a postcard that reminds people of kind of the basic things, you know, before you work on trees, here's what you need to remember. Also, really clarifying in much more simple language the permit process on our website. And we've been looking at some templates from other cities like Portland, where they've actually tried to really simply explain to residents what's going on. And also continuing the tree walks and articles in the city newsletter. One of the things that the articles in the newsletter actually have come out of something that we're really excited about, which is a collaboration with other nature-interested groups in the city. So the Natural Tacoma articles were a collaboration of Historic Tacoma, the Tacoma Horticultural Club, Friends of Sligo Creek, the Committee on the Environment, and the Tree Commission. So it was really wonderful to pool our interest and our expertise and have this series of articles, and we hope to continue that. We also, the Douglas Tallamy Talk is something that was co-sponsored by this Natural Tacoma Coalition and the city. And so all of the groups publicized this, and it's very exciting to think that we could work together in this kind of collaborative way to, you know, preserve, protect, and promote our natural heritage in Tacoma Park. So we think that we hope the city will be interested in helping to sponsor more of these kind of collaborative events and activities, and that might be a way to really expand our capacity for outreach and education in a really cooperative way. Also, we have the idea certainly of working with school groups and scout groups to assist in planting and maintaining trees, and there have been some scout leaders who have talked with us over the last year about doing this, because, you know, this is a wonderful opportunity for children to get out and help plant trees, help water them and take care of them. It's one of these things, though, that seems to require you know, a level of organization and time that it is hard for volunteers to kind of get it together. So I think we're just trying to flag that as a real possibility, but again, if there was some kind of resources available for to promote that kind of thing in the city, I think there'd be some real possibilities there to get youth involved. I mean, we've all have talked about that. Another major idea we've had is to work with the sustainability manager and other city staff, like the planning office, to incorporate trees in sustainability goals, in terms of like moving towards zero carbon goals, energy savings, et cetera. That the trees have not really been included under that whole kind of consciousness about sustainability yet, and we think there's some real opportunities there. Let's see. Also, we're thinking that we need to find some ways to make sure that contractors, realtors, and house buyers are more aware of our tree ordinance requirements. And I don't know if we had a specific idea there or not, but was there something?
No, but we flagged it as a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you were addressing that
Particularly
too.
with contractors, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We need to make them more aware.
Yeah, we've had people come to us who the contractor had taken some action on trees that got the homeowner in trouble, and then the contractor leaves and the homeowner has to pay for the replacement trees. So we just feel that we could probably do some educational things like, I think we did on the pesticide issue, that if we could organize, maybe if the city could help organize some kind of workshops for, you know, for some of the local tree care people, in terms of, and landscaping companies maybe even, to make sure that they don't accidentally or on purpose do certain things, you know.
Really should, the homeowners need to know that it is their responsibility.
Yeah, let me just say, nothing strikes fear into my soul more than hearing somebody firing up a chainsaw in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
I just go, oh my God, what, you know, I just get panicky.
Yeah.
In terms of our enforcement action, we frequently cite the contractor as well as the homeowner. So
Good.
it's, yeah, they're equally culpable, and oftentimes certainly the most responsible.
Can I ask a question on the contractor thing, because
Yeah.
obviously a lot of the permits are not.
Most of them are given out by the county for contractors, right? But as I recall, when I got a fence replaced at my house, there was this requirement that there be this one letter from the city of Tacoma Park. And when I contacted the county, they said, here's what you need to do for us, but by the way, you need to get this letter from the city of Tacoma Park. So I'm just wondering if there's some way we could get the county, not when someone's doing a plumbing job, but when somebody's doing an outside job, just, oh, by the way, if you're working at Tacoma Park, you have to get this tree permit. They can do it for the fence. They should be able to do it for something else. So I'm not sure what it would take
Well,
to
it's
do
not
that.
just
but-
Well,
that.
I mean, anything.
That is what happens.
Tree
now.
protection
That is what
plans.
happens. We do get people for a variety of different activities that are told by the county that they need a letter from the planning staff, and they know and cite the tree ordinance as part of, that's a key portion that they mention.
One of the challenges that we find is that for folks that are willing to sort of not read clearly and carefully, they see that letter from the city that says, be informed, there may be city codes and city requirements, so just because you get a county permit doesn't mean you're done, you gotta come check with the city. We've often had contractors and homeowners tell us, I thought that was my permit. So they see that letter from the city and they think,
They get the
box
right ahead to
checked,
go ahead.
I've got my city letter, I'm good. And you ask them to read that and say, does that say anywhere that you have ordinance, permit, authority? No. So, oftentimes we've had conversation with the planning office about ways to make the language clear in that letter that this is not a permit, this is not authority, that, this is just informing of you of your responsibility. We have had conversations trying to get the county to be more rigorous in making sure that those parties have contacted the city. And I don't think we're going to get any more than them saying, hey, show us the letter. And if you show them the letter, they're good.
I will say that I hear staff when they hand over the letter going, usually asking about the project and giving information that you do need to go over and talk to so-and-so about this, or this may involve trees, and here's
Right.
the contact to go for that.
Would there be any merit, or is it even conceivable to expect contractors to post a bond, even just a small one, a couple $100, that they lose if they don't get some sign off from the arborist office saying that they've received, going through that process?
I don't know, we have very specific criteria for when we ask for bonds.
Right.
It typically involves either stormwater
Sure.
or other requirements where they have to show value of what we're allowing them permission to do, and then they have to provide a bond. We do have bonds for tree protection. So if someone's got a tree under protection and we're worried about the contractor's ability to maintain the permit conditions, we oftentimes will require them to post a bond that pays for removal of that tree should it die within 2 years. But I think the language on bonds, and Ken could probably speak to this, is very clearly tied to an expectation, what you're bonding for,
Right.
what the dollar figure is related to.
This is a background question, but I think it's pertinent to this.
Yeah.
If we're losing some percent of our tree canopy over a 5 or 10 year period, is it your view that we're losing it, and the Public Works Director's view that we're losing it because trees are dying and not being replaced, or because trees are being illegally cut down?
It's not quite that simple.
I'd say, yeah, it's complicated, but probably more because trees are dying. This is what's
And I
caused
think-
And I ask that
concern.
because if we're trying to
Yeah.
preserve the mission that the commission is given is to promote and protect the tree canopy, and so if that's a bigger problem, we should focus our.
Well, I would love
So-
to address that in more detail, but think we have to adhere to this agenda first.
One thing we could say, yeah, I think that one thing we could say,
Priorities for the city.
Right.
Yeah.
To be clear, like priorities for the city, that
could be a priority, yeah.
Is if most of the
I
trees that we're
spend
losing
half
are-
of my
yeah.
professional life on that very topic, and hence my volunteering. As a matter of fact, I was requested by the former mayor and the arborist that to apply because there was an opening. Because I've been at Tacoma Park since '81, so
yeah, I think that
not
one
a newcomer.
Yeah, and one thing about, it's not so much just that trees are dying, but that there's a lack of tree care for a lot of trees that don't have to die. I mean, so that's part of our concern too, is that if there was more of an awareness on the part of residents about how they could better take care of their old trees, there's no particular reason why a lot of these trees need to fail. So really, and this is something that Todd was really really becoming active in the last couple of years, is really encouraging people to significantly mulch their big trees. I mean, not just little tiny volcanoes, not at all volcanoes, but large areas of mulch under the trees, that kind of thing. And you know, there are ways of watering even big trees in droughts, and that's something most people don't know they can do or that they should do. So that's something I think that we've been concerned about too, in terms of preserving the trees we have. And what we've heard from I think from people like Todd and other arborists is that it's really important to take, this kind of gets into the next recommendations we were going to talk about here on maintaining trees better, is that it's really important to try to preserve these older trees while we're planting the next generation, so that we have canopy in place as the next generation and the generation after that are growing. Because it's very difficult to, I mean, with climate change, we don't know whether the trees we plant will survive or not. And a lot of these little trees are not being properly taken care of either. And if they die, you know, and we've kind of given up on the big trees.
Well,
So.
I mean, this is a conversation that sort of undergirds everything that we do. I'm of the viewpoint that we pay attention to the big trees, and it's not that we shouldn't pay attention to the big trees, but we pay attention to the big trees almost to the exclusion of understanding the complexities of our canopy, because the big trees are what the permit process addresses. And they become an issue when there's a desire to take them down, or having them taken down is forced upon us. But a healthy canopy isn't going to just have big trees. It's going to have, you know, a healthy growth at 5 years, and a healthy growth at 10 years, and a healthy growth at 20 years. Because trees as living organisms will die naturally, and nowadays maybe even unnaturally. So there needs to be some better balance in helping people understand that just because you might have 2 or 3 mature canopy trees in your yard doesn't mean you're done. You have to kind of project 40 years into the future and where they're going to be in order for that growth overall to be healthy.
I have a question. I wanted to go back to I think Ms. Braithwaite, you talked about the inventory of trees and where that comes into this whole conversation.
Colleen, did you want to do the next set of recommendations?
Right, and one other thing, just before we leave the idea of outreach and education, is that we think that it would be wonderful if we could reach out more to, if the city and the Tree Commission and everyone together could reach out more to apartment and condo residents and owners in education and in planting opportunities, because we think that there would indeed be some interest there, and we shouldn't leave them out of the picture.
Great. Do you have a question? Sure, why not?
Because this is exactly why I came tonight.
Okay.
With this conversation, I'll try to be really quick. My perspective is I'm a homeowner in Tacoma Park. I've been here for 16 years as a homeowner, and I work in the conservation sector, as does my husband, so we're very big conservationists. However, we have 5 enormous tulip poplars in our backyard. We call them our $50,000 liability. And increasingly, I am considering leaving Tacoma Park, selling my home, wondering if anyone will buy it, because they look like the biggest liability ever about to fall onto my children because of them all being tulip poplars, shallow branches. I have sought advice from the arborist, et cetera. And I give this example because I have had numerous conversations with Todd over the years. And I work on climate change issues and resilience in other countries. And what I see here in Tacoma is exactly what you're saying. We have a serious problem that I think is about to come upon us, which may deal with liability issues for the city. And I think before we hire for a new arborist, it would be my strong opinion that we should revisit the code, consider how we can take into account the balance between safety of our citizens, potentially property value devaluation, and the aging of our tree canopy, which is very real, and Todd was constantly talking about this. We cannot put enough value on young trees in those same yards, and the replanting and the financial trade-offs that people are making who really want to make the right decisions. So I'll just leave it at that. I think it's worth an entire meeting of this group and others to try to solve that problem with the climate crisis. We saw every third house on our street had a tree that almost fell on top of it and almost killed a number of people in that last derecho, and we're going to see more of that. Thank you. Thank you.
That's one of my concerns.
Okay. If I could just point out,
Yes. We'll take one more, and then we're going to go back to the.
Very brief. I just want to tag on to what was just said. The property I've owned for 20 years here in Tacoma Park, we have planted over 10 trees on our property. We have a sizable lot. However, the street I live on, 320 Piney Branch, I have noticed trees falling. There was one tree that fell into the power lines in another property because it was rotten at the base. Nothing was done. As you know, the creek bed that runs across Piney Branch there by George Leventhal's house, one side of that area is a mess. There's timber that's been cut, left on the ground. It is full of vines and invasive species. I don't know exactly where property lines end and where public property is, but it needs tending to. I walk that street every day. It is a mess. And to your point, we are risking the new growth by leaving these trees in the state they are because pests get in there. As I said, the tree that fell down on Piney Branch. I think it needs to be a comprehensive look at this canopy and this forest in this area as to what can be done. As you know, Sligo Creek, people have gone in there and taken out the invasive species as much as possible. I think it has to be done in a comprehensive way.
Sir, we're going to move on. Thank you very much. No, it's okay. I just want to.
Because I think it is all.
Thank you. Ms. Cordes, did you want to continue?
Well, just that we do see that private property is the largest potential area for expanding the tree canopy. And one way to achieve this might be to devote some funds from our the replacement fees for tree permits to create some kind of a grants program for residents and possibly for neighborhoods for planting trees on private property. And this could be, this could be a kind of a way of bringing neighborhoods together, communities together to plan for where do they have area in their, like on a particular block, maybe you don't have room for to plant a canopy tree, but your next door neighbor does. So that it could be some kind of maybe a fun competitive process for grants in this area, but thinking about this as something that could come out of the replacement fees, in addition to a lot of that money going for street trees, because the street trees, if they're under the lines, have to be little tiny trees. They can't be canopy trees. And if they're larger trees, who's going to take care of them? There isn't always that consciousness about keeping them alive while they're young. Another idea in terms of maintaining our canopy and caring for the newly planted trees is to really bring tree canopy considerations into planning for the land use master plan and planning activities generally, including thinking of creative ways to incentivize planting trees on private property. And I think maybe that this is something that our residents who've spoken, kind of relates to what you're talking about, that are there ways of providing residents with incentives for taking care of the old trees, for really monitoring their health so that if they become hazardous, that's when that's noted and taken care of, and also, taking care of the old and planting new and taking care of the new ones. Another idea would be to consider dedicating part of that new, I think it's in the police department, the new environmental enforcement position to include outreach and education about the tree canopy, some portion of that job. And then last, we think there are some really good opportunities for the city to do a better job of modeling best practices for tree care for trees that are in the right-of-way and for trees that are in our parks. And again, when we think about our parks, there could be opportunities there for creating neighborhood and community events to, you know, do fun things with the trees in the parks and taking care of them.
I'd like to add one more thing. This came to my attention, I don't know, this is something that Arlington put out. I'll pass it around, and their grants for private owners to plant another tree on their property is another. It's just an example of encouraging, because I personally see the biggest increase in our canopy in private yards. I see huge holes where many trees could go.
Yeah,
I
city-
had a derecho situation, and I lost 3 old-growth trees, so I can't put bigger trees. It's a hard access place, but 5 smaller oaks will be going in early spring.
The city has had a twice-a-year bulk buy where we do offer a $100 discount in a price of a $195 tree. It's a 1-year, 1.5 to 2 inch nursery stock quality tree. So that has been a program that the city's had underway for probably 4 years now.
That's a great program.
And it's actively used. We're just doing our fall bulk buy, and we have 23 trees that have been purchased through that for this fall. So that's about typical. We do 20 to 30 with each session, so we do it in the fall and the spring. And these are all on private property.
I've heard a lot of talk about the coupons, and people are excited.
How is that funded, Daryl?
It's in our budget.
Yeah, it has a line item in the budget.
And how does it relate to the replacement fees?
How does
It
you
doesn't.
cannot use it as a replacement tree. If you're removing a tree, you can only use it as an additional tree. You can't
No, I
use the
understand that.
$100
I mean, the funding itself has no relationship to the amount that's collected in the replacement fees?
in the tree fund. No, we don't currently fund it through the tree fund.
Well, I also, the idea of, you know, the neighborhood contests and things, I would just say, what's the neighborhood association that Lori's in?
The Long Branch.
Long Branch just did a wonderful tree planting with the, after purchasing the trees, that neighborhood association won through the Georgetown Energy Prize. So I think that was, it was very well run. I think all the trees were planted on private property. So I think we have some good models out there to look into.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's encouraging.
It is. It was a great morning. It's cold, but it was good. Okay. All right, so then I think moving to the discussion of issues related to PEPCO, WSSC, and other utility projects. Did you all want to? That's you. All right, Tina.
That's my chair. I'm sure there's going to be a really robust dialogue on this. I would offer the suggestion. I've got 8 points or so here just to go through them very quickly, and then that will, I'm sure, provoke a lot of conversation. As you know, we had situations in this last year, both with PEPCO and the WSSC. They were brought to the commission by concerned residents, and so we felt that some degree of response was necessary. We, through that process and in preparation for this meeting, tried to summarize how we move forward in a more sort of positive and engaging kind of way. So I'll just go through this list of recommendations quickly. We recommend that the city staff secure and convey information to the city council, the commission, and residents on proposed public utility projects that will impact trees as soon as the city becomes aware of them. Robust and appropriate environmental impact assessment for large projects should be made available to homeowners. before they are required to make any decisions about their property. Closer supervision of utility crews. Utilities should be held accountable for mistakes. The city should ensure that residents are informed before utilities begin work on a project about the scope of the proposed work on their property and in their neighborhood through written notification and maps on the city website for proposed work. The city should ensure that homeowners know their rights regarding utilities, for example, the ability to decline pruning or removal of trees on private property. The city should consider removing current incentives for homeowners to remove trees that are not clearly imminently hazardous. The city should consider making tree permit decisions publicly available, giving a 15-day posting and appeal for trees not considered imminently hazardous.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one?
Sure. The city should consider making tree permit decisions publicly available, given a 15-day posting and appeal for trees that are not considered imminently hazardous or interfering with the utilities.
I'm a little confused because that's the process now.
This is
If
with
it's
respect to utilities. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is with respect to utilities, so not the general private property.
So part of what we went through was where does the ordinance come in with specific respect to utilities. So, and that's also why we asked to move the utilities before the ordinance, because we figured that would be a discussion point. The city should consider requirements for a higher level of analysis for trees not considered hazardous or directly interfering with utilities. The City Council should consider updating the memoranda of understanding with PEPCO and WSSC. Our estimation was that it would either be more beneficial or more fruitful to address this through MOU rather than trying to put this into the ordinance and then have a jurisdictional question remain. It might create more contention. So that was sort of our summary of ideas.
I'd just like to say that some of those came up when we talked during the period right around when the PEPCO work was taking place, a month or so ago, and I think in particular having some sort of permitting process, at least for those that are not directly threatening the utilities and the wires in the case of PEPCO, or otherwise imminently hazardous, I think definitely does make sense, and I think that has to apply to whether they're in the public rights of way or elsewhere. I think that's crucial. I think the public notice process, as I recall when we discussed this, something was sent out multiple months in advance, and then maybe we would get a map when the time came closer. But I just think that, for the average person, again, this gets back to what I was talking about earlier with the closing documents. You have to really give people something when it's pretty near happening, but still gives them a little time to do something about it. If it's way in advance or at the last minute, you're not really giving them information that's useful. And so if we can come up with a system, I think it'd be great to let people know, hey, in the next 6 months, PEPCO's going to be doing this. That might seep in, but when we're getting to the point where it's going to happen in a given neighborhood, there has to be, I'd say, like a couple of weeks notice so that there's time for people to understand it, but it's not so far off that they're just going to throw the thing out and tune it out. So, and I don't know exactly what the mechanism is for that, but I think that's, without that, we're not really living in a city where people are being served. We have to have something like that.
I received my notice for Sycamore Avenue where I live a week ahead, and I, anything with PEPCO on it or WSC or a utility, I open up right away. But I personally walked up and down the street talking to people, and most people did not realize that was the notification that in a week we would have our pruning schedule occurring. So I don't know, maybe another mailing or
Well, I think all
or
the
maybe,
things,
you know, neighborhood captains that
I think all the things that, I believe, not having read all the things, but I would say these are all things that have come up in the past. They're things that, as a council, as a staff, I know we've been frustrated. We've talked about this, particularly when we're talking about WSSC or other utilities in doing things and advocating in Annapolis for legislation on this. And we're working with other municipalities to get this changed. We are not the only municipality for whom this is an incredibly frustrating experience dealing with the utilities on this issue.
It's an MML priority.
It's an MML, Maryland Municipal League priority. So I think perhaps the best step on this issue is, and I would say that for all your comments, if my colleagues agree with this, if you could send them to the city clerk to be put in with the minutes, and particularly on this issue, this might be something that city staff can look at and say, you know, here's how we're working on each of these things. I know the city manager and I are going to be getting a meeting soon with Jerry Pasternak, who's a VP at PEPCO for our region, to go over what happened this week.
I do have.
Yeah, he's very willing to come and talk. I will leave it at that.
Where that goes, right? I do have one question to invite a broader perspective on your part. With the WSSC project, we only came aware of that 5 years after it had started, and part of the frustration that we saw the homeowner at that point who stands to lose most of her trees was the idea that they were being told by WSSC that they would be provided with no environmental impact assessment until the homeowners had made a decision on what they wanted to do.
Well, I think in that case, because it was a multi-year case, and I think one of the things that you discussed in making sure that when notice is given to the council and residents, that we include now the tree commission moving forward, so you all know that. I think that's an excellent remedy for this type of situation. I think in this case, because it was multiple years, because there were many things about this project that went on between grinder pumps, backyard alignments, and all this.
Unusually tough.
It was a very long process with WSSC, and some of the tree issues didn't come up until more recently. So I would say that, you know, this is, I think if we follow your recommendation, and when there is a major project like by WSSC or things like that, that you are provided with notice with it, then I think that will handle that situation.
That was sort of that educational piece.
And I would also say,
that we were providing advice, but that we were asking questions. And my personal sentiment on it was that those were the kinds of questions that needed to be asked from day one, so that people were thinking in the right.
Exactly, and I would just say, because it was a WSSC project, many of us were also asking those questions of the Department of the Environment at the county level. So it's not to discount the work that you all are doing, but we were working with Councilmember Hans Reamer's office. We were working with our state delegate Jamie Raskin, and so you know, it was at that level that we were asking the county Department of Environment to be doing an assessment. But again, I think in the future, including you in the announcement earlier on, then you're aware of what's going on.
And if I might, I think one of the things that we believe we can do better going forward, partly with just improvements in our website and some of our mapping technologies and that kind of thing, is to have easily read maps and easily identified properties, and maybe photographs or whatever that identify when we have a whole series of, when we know these 20 trees are either to be pruned or taken down or whatever, that can be a very easily understandable document on the website in some form, so that whether or not, I mean, yes, we should time it just at the exact time, but at least we have an opportunity if something gets sent out on a neighborhood list, or people have a place to go to look and say, oh, that is my next door neighbor's house, I bet, they've been away, or whatever, and just, have that information available. And that's something we want to see and believe we can have available in the future.
And I think also having the urban forest manager, I'm going to use that new title, because the urban forest manager does know of these projects.
Right. Well,
So-
I've been out there walking it.
Right, and so I think having that person be more part of your meetings, again, the flow of information moving forward, I think will
Then we
improve.
can help.
Yeah.
Then we can help.
And if
yeah.
there's, if there's an expectation on our side and the side of the new urban forest manager, if we all have the expectation that when the utility first proposes something, before the decisions have been made about which trees are going to be significantly pruned and which trees are going to be removed, the tree commission already is being informed. And for example, I mean, one reason why that would make a difference for instance, this year, is that we had no idea that Pepco was getting permits to cut down trees that were not hazardous and that were not threatening utility lines. We never were able to have a conversation ahead of time about why that was happening. And so I'm just saying that in the future, the residents, showing them a map of where the decisions have been made is indeed going to be helpful. But what's also important is that the council and the commission, and to some extent the residents, have more information at the proposal stage before the decisions have been made about removing trees. And if there's any way we could work with you, Councilmember Smith, on the work you're doing at the state level, we would be, I think, very interested in working with other municipalities too.
Sure.
And
I
the
think
one,
this is, go ahead. Peter.
The one other thing is, I know we're running short on time, but
Just speak up just a
yeah,
little
one of
bit.
the items that you mentioned, Tina, was, I think, in this list was the sort of odd incentive that exists for private homeowners when Pepco was coming around with the arborist to say, well, I mean, I don't really, do I have to take down that tree? It's not threatening the wires. And the answer was, well, it's fine now, but in a little while it might be bad, and if you do it now, then you won't have to pay whatever the payment is. That just seems like a perverse kind of process that we don't intend. And even if it may have only been a relatively small number of trees, a few that I saw with my non-scientist eyes after the fact, it struck me that just wasn't the result that we wanted. And so I think that we've got to find a way to not have that taking place.
And I put myself in the homeowner's shoes, and in all of this utility issue, absent any other information,
right,
a homeowner is going to make the most economically expeditious decision.
Yes.
So by the time the homeowners were approached, they already had 2 certified arborists telling them that while it was not imminently hazardous, it was reasonable to take the tree down. Who is most Joe homeowner to say, well, I don't think that's a good idea, and take on the financial possibility that comes along with that decision? Now, I know, I'm certain there were quite a number of trees where Pepco came to the arborist and the arborist said no, and that never got to the homeowner. But I, as a homeowner, I would be really kind of shaking in my shoes a little bit to say no to a situation like that. And then it's a question of, well, how do you know how to make a informed choice? Right. Unless it's an activist who is willing to go out and hire someone to make their case. It's almost inevitable that the homeowner is going to take the tree down.
And it relates to the fact that if a tree is considered hazardous, you get a waiver and you don't have to do a replacement fee. But if you get a permit, it's because the tree is not hazardous. And so you have to do replacement fees. And the utility was both paying to cut down the tree and also doing the replacement fee. So it becomes perverse for the city, I think, as well as for the residents.
But I'd like to make one last comment. The real reality, the overarching thing that's going on, if we step back, is these utility lines are going to continue being there, and long term we need to educate people on better tree planting placements so that they avoid that. We know, for instance, every 4 years, they're gonna cut back 10 feet. And that blue sky, that means straight up. If it's too close to the trunk, they're gonna take the whole tree down. We need to start on our utility side telling homeowners, I calculated it's about 25 feet at least back. Because you have 50 to 60 foot canopy trees that you're planting when you plant oaks and, maples and all kinds of tupelos or whatever. So a long range plan, and this is where we would work with the arborist, is let's see, and we educate the town to think that way. Replacement trees, let's put them where they'll thrive and survive. And that is, that will be the picture of our tree canopy in the future. The utility side will be back, and in the public spaces you can have your understory trees, because an urban forest is not like a regular forest. We have lots of obstructions, buildings changing wind patterns, impervious spaces, driveways, walkways. They change how a tree operates in this sort of an urban area. It's a biggie.
I have a question for you, Daryl. WSSC is required to get a permit from the county when they do any work.
No.
Are you sure?
No.
Because
They may cooperatively agree to follow the permitting process, but they are exempt from any local regulation.
Because according to Gaithersburg attorney, they are supposed to get a permit.
They
from
may have
Montgomery.
an MOU that says, we'll follow your rules, but we don't have to follow your rules.
And Prince George's. There's something in the code that says that they have to do it.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I'm not even aware of tree permit requirements like we have in Montgomery or Prince George's County, so I'm not exactly sure what he might be talking about.
Okay.
now there are certain cases where, for instance, if a utility company wants to work in a right-of-way, they have to get a traffic control detour plan approved by the county, those types of things. They're required to do that. But in terms of following our tree ordinance, it's a voluntary thing. It's a voluntary thing for WSSC. We can't charge them a permit fee. We can't enforce compliance. It's a cooperative arrangement based on goodwill. With the other utility companies, Washington Gas and Pepco, they have to follow our permit process. But for Pepco in particular, there's Public Service Commission standards that they use as guidelines. And those are the laws. Those are their rules. And we can deny to some degree when there's some flexibility, but if Pepco says, based on the Public Service Commission's requirements of blue sky, clearance, line, whatever, we can't object to their removal of a tree on public right-of-way. They have authority to do whatever they want to do on public right-of-way. On private property, they have to get the private property owner's approval. And I must say I'm confused as trying to, in my mind, figure out a path forward, because as Tina said, if you've got a Pepco arborist saying this tree needs to come down and the city arborist saying this tree needs to come down, why do we think the tree doesn't need to come down?
Well, I think that what has
Because they're not
happened is
giving-
that
they're
they're
not
not
giving it a
hazardous.
waiver.
The arborist, at least the city arborist, has determined that the tree is not hazardous. And we know that I believe that the former arborist told us there were many cases of this where the tree was not hazardous and it was not in violation of any of the line clearance requirements.
And it is
So it
all
wasn't
the permit
Daryl.
removals that were done in this last round were due to defects in the tree. They weren't healthy trees that were being removed. There were trees that
Well,
had
but
issues.
see-
And in fact, we had a third arborist come when this was questioned, and they verified that every tree that was still on the list that hadn't been removed had a valid reason for being removed.
Daryl,
But-
did that consulting arborist go and visually inspect every tree that
Yes.
was on the list? I thought
They
they only
did-
looked at 4 or 5.
The five that for a common person to drive by and say, hey, that looks like an okay tree, what's the issue? Of the remaining trees that hadn't been removed, I went through all of them. Some of them were dead as doornails, others were clearly hazardous. For the ones that were just looked okay when you drove by. Those are the ones we had a consulting
But I
arborist come
think
and look at.
This also goes
Thank you for
back
that
to,
info.
well, a couple of things. One, the language exempting the utilities in the tree ordinance clearly states hazardous. And we had asked for a legal opinion from Ken, where he came back and indicated that the thought at the time was they weren't going to be taking trees down that weren't considered hazardous. So once a tree is decided not to be hazardous,
or interfering with the line,
then what is it? And I
Well,
think
if it
that
has a
was
defect,
really
it's
where
considered
it was
hazardous.
not clear what it was, you know, just because by the time it got to the homeowner, it was already a done deal. There was no context to understand. You're telling me that at some point that in the next 4 years this tree is going to be a problem, but it might not be, but it might be, but it might not be.
If I might, I think one of the things that I'm excited about having this meeting is that we've got a good discussion and we have things as we move forward. If we have a little bit of time to the next time we think Pepco's going to come back through. But I think having a lot more information, having this stuff posted, will answer many questions in the future, as opposed to having the arguments over some of the past issues, which
I agree.
it's a little bit hard for us to judge at this point.
Yeah, and I would just say also in
Good
terms
point.
of like one of the things that we discussed when we talked about legislative priorities a few months ago, that one of our lobbyists thought the idea was that in seeing whether or not we could get legislation introduced in Annapolis that would use a standard for, what is the right terminology I'm looking for? Tree, but basically, right, you have WSSC that says, oh, we can come this close to a tree and you're okay, that's the standard. And then you have Petco saying, oh no, we need to take this much, and that's their standard.
Right,
and
to have some
Right.
common parameters of too
Right.
close, too far, all those kinds of things that
Really important.
that's really important. So,
conflict.
right,
Yeah.
and so one of the things that we will be exploring again this year is can we get some standards when we're talking about utilities and the work that's being done, because we don't have a set of standards right now, and it's sort of like whatever fits their situation to benefit the utility. So
The other legislative thing that I've tossed out there, and it hasn't made it on the MML list yet, which is fine because there's good priorities on there, is some sort of pilot program to look at burying the lines in some heavily forested areas, which I just put out there as another thing for us to consider.
One other thing that we've also talked about is the idea of requiring a higher level of analysis for the trees, which Tina said, and we're talking there about things like sonic tomography and resistographs. So they're much more technically advanced ways of evaluating whether a tree is really hazardous or not. So instead of just doing a visual inspection or taking a hammer or a mallet and hitting a tree, there are much more, 21st century techniques and even, 20th century techniques than what we often use. So to expect Pepco, which has a lot of money invested in cutting down trees and pruning trees and then doing our replacement fees, one idea would be to do we want to expect them to have to do a higher level of analysis before we would agree that that tree needs to come down?
But remember, it's by agreement.
But I mean, if the tree is not hazardous, in other words.
Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't know what you meant. Go ahead.
no, they.
all right. So Ms.
Sorry.
Tunis, yes?
Yeah.
I apologize, I couldn't come earlier, and just on this point of hazardous, it may behoove us to do a little bit of research on what we, as a city, considers hazardous versus what the National Society of Arboriculture considers hazardous, because you can have a perfectly healthy tree, but if it's going to fall and there's something within its fall line, who knows? I mean, it could be an atomic bomb. They're gonna say that tree is hazardous, so we should need, and I don't agree with that, and I don't think we as a society, as the city, in terms of the values of the trees, agree that just because there is a target somewhere near a tree, that makes the tree hazardous. So,
Thank you. So I think the last thing that we were going to discuss tonight is big picture on the tree ordinance. We're not going to go,
Right.
even though I see Councilmember Qureshi has his entire city code with him tonight. I would say
I
we're
have mine
not going
too.
to go line by line through the tree ordinance, but I think we've already raised a number of points tonight. Councilmember Smith raised when we talked about when insurance companies refuse to insure someone. We've talked about safety issues, the aging canopy, all things to consider as we're moving forward as a council to look at the tree ordinance. And so we just wanted to open it up for some big thoughts about, and we will come back to you, I promise, as we have these conversations, but we wanted to just kind of like start it off tonight.
So it's how's it working overall? It's a kind of it's a subjective opinion, I guess we can offer, because we don't have anything much in the way of data or survey or anything like that. But we're 5 volunteers, we're 5 citizens. We talk to our neighbors. Our neighbors know we're on the tree commission, and then we get feedback from the public to the tree commission. So based on all that, we've talked this over ad infinitum on the tree commission, and I think basically we can say that we think the tree commission, the tree ordinance is working pretty well. That's our sense, and we do hear grousing about it. Complaints of various kinds here and there. A number of them focus more on the not being able to understand the language of the ordinance. So we've talked earlier tonight about simplifying it or clarifying it so that the public has a better understanding of it. But our sense is, and this is subjective, we infer that there's general support for the tree ordinance as a strict, forward-thinking document. I have to say that I've been on the tree commission now for maybe a little over a year, and I thought I was going to be a judge. I mean, I thought I was going to be doing a lot of adjudication because that's just a sense I had before I got on this thing. And I've been on it for a year. We've had one case, one appeal that came to the tree commission, and in that one we sided with the homeowner, and the arborist sort of changed his position in the middle of the hearing because that so much information came out, and I thought that Todd was really open-minded about it. But we're not seeing a lot of stuff coming our way that shows dissatisfaction with the tree ordinance, which leads us to believe that people are basically supportive of it. Although we do need to, make it easier to understand. But we did hear a lot, loud and clear, during the utility debacles, or whatever you want to call them, with WSSC and with Pepco, even though that doesn't really have much to do with the tree ordinance. But that's what we heard from the public. So in terms of appeals, I'm not sure exactly what you meant. Should there be a process for appeals other than appeals of tree permit decisions? We've had one appeal in a year and a half, and you asked should there be a process for hardship appeals. We've also not heard much from the public about that. I think we had one case where someone brought to us the financial hardship aspect of it, but just one. And again, this is anecdotal because we're not, we don't have the capability of doing a broader survey. But we've heard some things tonight about the tree ordinance that I think are helpful to hear. Some we've heard, I'm hearing for the first time. One last point. We like to think of the tree assessments not as fines, but as replacements for something important that's been lost. And we generally see strong support for tree planting that these assessments make possible.
Yeah, if I can just address the couple things that I've heard, so that are items that wouldn't come to you because of the way the tree ordinance is written. The complaint that I hear about the most from residents and from council members are people who've been assessed a certain number of replacement trees, and it's a lot more money than they expected. And they don't have an appeal mechanism about that. They think that, they really think their tree isn't that good, so why should it equal X number of replacement trees? And so there is nothing that other than we can say, sorry, you're out of luck, that's the computation. That's where I hear the biggest number of complaints. It's a possibility, and I don't know that's a good idea or not, that you could function in some appeal measure of that. Or that there's, I mean, frankly, I wouldn't want to get into that discussion, but it could be very simple. It could be similar to a zoning hardship type of case, and so that's a possibility. So I'm just throwing that out as the biggest complaint that I hear about the tree ordinance is that. I think, you know, the other thing, which isn't really a tree ordinance issue, but underlies so much of this, is money. Right. Trees cost money to maintain. They cost money to cut and prune and the whole bit. And so, whereas somebody might really think this is a great tree city, it's a different thing when they have to pay $5,000 and do it on a regular basis. And so, as we think through budgeting or other kinds of programs, you know, that's part of that lever about why I get the complaints, I think, about the replacement costs. So I just wanted to explain what that item was about.
Can I ask a quick question? With respect to the hearing that you handled in the last year and a half, and I asked people in Ward 3 who were curious about this to tune in. Can you very briefly, in 2 minutes, describe what the issue was? Mm-hmm. And then I would like for each of you to just more broadly tell me whether you feel equipped to handle a hearing. Do you feel like you have enough of a system in place that you think that there's a procedure in place that you can adequately govern and sort of administer a hearing, and are you comfortable with that if we think about other things in terms of appeals and the like? So could you
we had in about the last year, we had 3 sort of cases present to us. One was a situation where a tree removal permit was approved. A neighbor contested it. We also had the situation that Denny referred to, which actually it was rather complex because it was a subdivision of a property with a wooded backyard, and there was a building permit. It was approved as a developable lot. There was no consideration of the trees that were on that property in approving it as a lot that someone could build a house on. An owner bought that property in good faith, drafted plans to build a house on it. At the time, there were 6 mature canopy trees. From the time the permit was approved, forgive me, I don't know the technical term, but when it was approved to be subdivided as a developable lot, there were 6 mature canopy trees on it. In the intervening years, a couple had come down on their own accord. The guy who bought the lot to build a house on applied to remove the remaining trees. Todd approved 1 and denied 2, and we heard an appeal on those denials. At the end of the day, it was extremely painful, but it was very, very clear that the issue was not with this homeowner. It was with that permit process in the first instance, and we couldn't deny him when he had dealt in good faith and had invested $200,000 in this land. So that was how that one went. And then the third case, which really wasn't a hearing, was a situation where a homeowner had applied for a tree removal permit and was approved, but got a fee for replacement trees that she was really unhappy about. In a certain sense, that was not a formal hearing process. That was us listening to her, which I actually was very happy that we did, because her situation actually was complex, and she had contractors who did work on her house that damaged her trees, and they were the ones that did not get the permit. So that did not come out in the process with the arborist's office. So she got more information from us, and we had some suggestions for her as well.
And that's the flagging of the homeowner is ultimately responsible for knowing the city's ordinances.
But I really like your question about whether we felt competent, if I heard it correctly, to do something like
I
this.
said comfortable, but
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just a citizen. I'm not a judge. I'm not an arborist. But I felt that process was really a good process. We devoted. It was a lengthy meeting. The
Ken
city
is there.
attorney was there. We were very well prepared in the legal aspects of it. There were all kinds of maps and visual materials available at that meeting for us to consider. I thought the discussion was very detailed and very fair. The homeowner had a builder and another consultant with him. Todd was there, we were there, the city attorney was there. As a citizen serving as a volunteer on this commission, I thought we were able to do a really fair job, and we didn't go into the meeting with any preconceived notions about anything. But I was kind of impressed with the process. I thought we were able to do a pretty good job.
And final question for you. If you do have a hearing come before you, and there's 5 of you on it, if you have a relationship with one of the parties, is there something in place where you either make that known to remove yourself from the situation?
Yeah,
I would.
there have been cases where one of us has recused herself for whatever reason. Yeah, so
Okay.
there's a mechanism for that.
Yeah, there is a mechanism.
Great.
And I should add that I've been serving on this commission for almost 17 years, and have seen many different cases. And I second Benny's comments. I think it's a very effective process. I think we're serving as jury. So, I mean, we come in with specialized knowledge, but we're expected to hear the evidence that's put forth on both sides, and then render a judgment. And we have the advice of our very able executive director, Ken Sigmund. And so I honestly think it's a very effective process.
Well, and I will say, I wouldn't feel comfortable if Ken wasn't there, but Ken is there. I mean, we had a whole, after all of the evidence was presented, we had a rather lengthy dialogue with Ken about the legal aspects of the case. So I felt very comfortable.
In each one we've taken away, we see opportunities for more education. You know, going forward, all right, homeowners need to know this better, so we're starting to think of the flyers or whatever, in support of our paid position people. And we're really happy to do that kind of work. I think it gets a little legal if we jump in there without proper certifications for adjudication on some things, or advising homeowners. I have to say personally, since I do that professionally anyway, I'm fine with it, but that's not how this commission, that was sort of a lucky plus. It's open to any citizen, this commission. And it isn't a requirement, it's a plus. And Carol she's a botanist, so we love having Carol here.
With regard to the question that you just responded to, in my time on the city council, I think that there has been nothing that has gotten my constituents angrier. To the point of just really fuming is when they have gotten assessed for tree replacements on trees, big trees in their yards that were questionable as to whether or not they deserved a waiver or not to be taken down, which is, of course, is wholly in the judgment of the arborist, whose job is to enforce the ordinance, and he has to use, or she has to use, his or her judgment as to whether a tree deserves to have a waiver. And so I think the ordinance needs to be changed so that the tree commission can play a role with regard to the punishment that gets handed out because that's basically what it is. People want to believe they need to take a tree down, and if they can't, get the arborist to agree with them, and then they not only have to pay the cost of taking the tree down, which we know is an expensive proposition, but then the insult to injury is to have to plant all these trees somewhere in the city or on their own property. And when I tried to explain that to them, and I have always defended the arborist in this case, because it's been his job. I mean, he's just, he got the job, and it's a difficult job. But I just think there needs to be some room for discretion, and I think the tree commission could play a role in that area.
Could you explain how exactly what you're recommending? Because I'm really not clear.
Well, there's a formula in the tree ordinance that says based on the diameter and the health of the tree, the parent health of the tree, and the interpretation that the arborist makes with regard to its longevity, he calculates using a formula, which is a good formula. I mean, you have to have some sort of, that X number of trees have to be replanted as a result of the decision to have this tree taken down, whether it's done with permission, with the understanding, or done illegally.
Well, I guess I'm still not clear, because the city arborist is carrying out the provisions of the ordinance, and as a representative of the city.
Right.
And
I'm not faulting the arborist.
No, but I'm saying we're volunteers, so it's not clear to me how we would be involved in that.
Well, I think where you would be to have what we referred to a minute ago as a hardship situation.
If I could make a couple suggestions based on what I'm hearing. I mean, I've seen so many of these permit decisions, and sometimes if it's a bigger tree, even in poor health, it could be a shocking number of replacement trees.
Yes.
And the amount of money that people have to spend.
Right.
I think the way to deal with that, rather than having kind of an appeal and deciding case by case, I mean, maybe the replacement calculations have to be different, but that should be in the code. And if there's going to be a hardship exception, I think there should be kind of financial parameters, and you can plug in somebody's income and assets and the cost of the replacement and figure out if there should be a waiver. But just knowing how the process works, I don't think it would be very effective for the arborist to say, I calculated these replacements, and then for somebody to come in and say, well, look, that tree, 10 branches fell off last month, so I think you should knock the replacement cost down.
That's basically what you're saying, Ken, is more or less what I was trying to get at. And so that's where I come from on that.
I think part of that is to remove an incentive to casually decide a tree should come down.
No, I understand why the ordinance was created in the first place, is that we're trying to get people, to keep people, incentivize people from taking down trees that should not be taken down, particularly trees that fit the definition of an urban forest tree.
Right.
Which is the other comment that I want to make, is that the definition of an urban forest tree is 24 inches or more in circumference at 4 1/2 feet above ground level, et cetera, et cetera. Well, and that basically means is that that's what the ordinance applies to. But if a tree's smaller than that, which was the question you were bringing up, these are canopy trees that haven't gotten to that dimension. They're fair game for somebody to take out, even if it's on its way to being a wonderful oak tree or a wonderful maple tree or something like that. And so when I think
because if it's over 6 inches, in diameter or 7
What does this
1/4?
definition mean then of an urban
7
forest tree?
5/8, then it goes into a permitting process.
Mhm.
And so then that tree does get assessed by the arborist.
And if it's smaller than 24 inches but bigger than 6 inches, it's in a different category.
No,
It's not a
it's
permit
smaller than-
removal, it's
It's
not.
not,
It's
it's
not
smaller
possible.
than 75.
It's exempt.
It's only when
from
it's
the law.
less than
There's
7.
nothing, yeah,
That's what he said.
sure. Oh,
I think that's what he was saying.
Yeah.
yeah,
there's
well,
no
Numbers are basically the
there's
same.
no process, it's a young
One's
tree.
the diameter, the other's color.
No. The 6 inches is in diameter in the historic district, is a
Right.
urban forest tree. 24 inches in circumference at 4.5 feet is in the other parts of the city.
And then
So
7 and 5/8.
Seven and 5/8.
7 and 5/8 inch diameter.
Right,
All right,
right.
well, basically, though,
So a tree about
we
4 or
need
5
to,
years older.
if I can get back away from all these inches, is that we need to have an ordinance that protects canopy trees no matter what size they are. I mean, because otherwise, a lot of these trees are never going to get a chance to become tall trees. And if we're only worrying about the ones that are already mature and create lots of shade, and we're not worrying about the ones that are going to get there someday, then we're never going to get our canopy. I mean, we're just exposing trees too much to risk. Am I making any sense? And I get affirmative nods here from the
Yeah.
audience.
And then there is hardship. What I see in my business are people on, that have retired. They've been here a long time, they've retired, they're on a fixed income.
Yeah.
And now there is a tree that, maybe it's hazardous, maybe not, but, you know, and it's in that kind of area, and they're
Well,
looking
yeah.
at the cost of the tree removal.
yeah, that's
and then
that's right.
10 tree
There
replacement.
are
That's a
people
hardship
who,
for
yeah,
a fixed
who,
income.
they don't have the money to put on a new roof or improve
Right.
the furnace and do all the things to make their house ecologically cool. I mean, there's a lot of things that people on fixed income, and we got a lot of them in
Yes.
the city, homeowners, they are simply cannot afford to deal with this. It
So
just,
I think we put the hardship cases on the list. I just want to be conscious of the time because it's
Yes.
9:35. I'm gonna take, Paul, you can go, and then I'm gonna check with the city council and we're gonna wrap up.
Okay,
Okay.
very quickly, there are a lot of concepts in this ordinance that are actually based on mid-20th century science. And this is kind of ties in with what Fred was talking, but in general, trees have changed. The way we view trees have changed. We view trees now as components of a system that provides us with ecosystem services. So we view, back in the mid-20th century and earlier, trees were viewed mostly from an aesthetic standpoint. Now we look at trees as doing things for us, as mitigating climate change, mitigating air pollution, controlling runoff, all these things. These kind of arbitrary designations of whether a tree is 7 5/8 or 6 inches in diameter really don't tie into the more modern concepts that we really need to address in planning for the utility of our urban forest. I think we need to ask ourselves, what ecosystem services do we need trees to provide, and how can we design the ordinance to best reflect that? And it could very well be, Fred, that what you were talking about, there may be a tree that is 4 feet in diameter, it's not providing any ecosystem services. There may be a tree that's 4 inches in diameter that's providing the kind of services that we need or will need when it matures, and we should be looking more to that tree. The same thing, people's penalties, or I hate to use the word, assessments, might be tied to the ecological value of the tree rather than just the size of the tree. So, for example, the individual behind me who has all these tulip trees, they're very nice in a forest, but they have very little value for an urban forest because they are intrinsically dangerous trees. So maybe taking down one of these trees doesn't cause as big a penalty as taking down, for example, a white oak of the same size, which has more utility and more value in an urban forest. So, as discussions progress, I would encourage us to be thinking about ecosystems and science rather than something that we did 80 years ago.
And just to note that if you actually read the introduction to the tree ordinance, it makes the point about the ecosystem values. So it was built into the ordinance, that consciousness. I hear what you're saying, that there are new ways of thinking about applying it too.
Okay, great. So, Councilmember Kovar, go ahead.
I'll be quick. I won't say all the things I wanted to say. It sounds like the definition of hazardous is sort of a judgment call. Catherine Trudis mentioned there's a couple different definitions, and in terms of imminence of it being a hazard, it was clear that our previous arborist at least was using that. And so I think I go beyond what Councilmember Schultz was talking about, and I understand that if the commission is not composed of scientists, this gets to be a question, but the number one thing I've heard, and it's sort of surprising that maybe you guys hadn't, is that the appeal process doesn't cover when something is potentially hazardous, could damage property, et cetera. And I think somehow finding a way to get that determination based on the health of the tree and how close it is to potentially being hazardous going forward, since obviously the arborist was perfectly willing to do that, although I objected to it in some of the instances when that happened with Pepco. I think there does need to be an appeal for that type of finding, and I don't know exactly how we would do it, but that's something I think should happen, even when it isn't a financial hardship per se.
We have listened to appeals on potential danger. The reason the tree was wanted, they applied to remove the tree was they felt that it was dangerous.
Yeah, but that was an objection to a permit denial, and I think what Peter is saying is that there's no current provision in the ordinance for an appeal of an assessment by the arborist, if I understand. So if the arborist says this is a 1% replacement tree but not a waiver, and the homeowner says, no, I think this is a waiver, that there's no way of appealing that.
Correct.
If that's my understanding.
Yep, no, that's right.
So, yeah.
One thing, and maybe Daryl would know this, but Todd did say something to us about a person could come back with a level 3 analysis of a tree.
And we recommend that.
Yeah, and I just want to say, even though it may appear to be a judgment call in terms of hazard evaluation, there is a science to hazard evaluation. It's not just kind of flip a coin, take a guess, watch the tea leaves. There really is, and there's criteria that people get trained in hazard tree evaluation. So there are scientific criteria. Now, that said, you can do whatever you want with science, but there are standards related to hazard evaluation that we can make.
In the question of Pepco, if these homeowners had said, well, geez, I don't want it, even though you're offering to pay for it, those trees would have stayed there, right? So obviously there's a gray area in this. It's not just a checking of a box. And I just think that to be the sort of community-minded place we are, another opportunity to explore that would make sense.
Right. So I think. Oh, did you want to say something?
I did.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I wanted to just associate myself with Paul's comments. I think that's a very accurate way to describe where we are. I agree with Peter Kovar in terms of the hardship and hazard appeals process and consideration. And then the issue that Councilmember Schultz brought up about young trees and the public brought up about young trees. The simple act of allowing somebody to get credit for any tree that's smaller than X inches DBH, you could count it if it's smaller than that size as credit for a future takedown, would immediately incentivize the protection of those trees. And right now we're let me just finish.
Yeah,
right now we're basically penalizing people unless you can be shown to go out and purchase a tree and have a receipt. That's the only way you get credit, which means that those trees that have actually survived, they didn't need water or they got water, they've made it. We're not creating any value for those survivors that are probably our best recruits. So there's a way to, I think, fix that problem.
That's a good point.
Well, I think moving forward, if you could give us, send to the city clerk your comments, and I know there are comments made by the public tonight. If you also have time to send them to the city clerk, that would also be, I think, very helpful, because there are some very useful things said by the residents in attendance in our meeting. I want to thank the members of the Committee on the Environment also for being here, because I think as this council has discussed our tree canopy, we really do see this as coming at it from a number of different places with the tree commission and working hand in hand with the Committee on the Environment and the city staff. I think moving forward, this was very helpful on a number of levels. One, as we are thinking about the budget and moving that, understanding where some of your priorities are that we can take into consideration as we're bringing on a new staff person, the input you've provided. And then in terms of relooking at our tree ordinance, I think the best thing would be is to get the new staff person on board, let them get their feet under them a little bit, and then begin that process in earnest of really taking a look at that. So I guess with that, we'll end the meeting. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great.